In the winter of 1884, the Northern Pacific ran a spur line up into the Bitterroot country of western Montana Territory, and on the 3rd of December, a woman stepped down onto the platform at a depot called Coyne's Crossing, with a single carpetbag and a wool shawl that was no match for the weather. She had answered a notice in a St. Paul matrimonial paper, a notice placed by a man who wanted, in his own words, a sensible wife who did not mind quiet. What the notice did not say was that the man who placed it had not written a word of it himself, that his sister had written it for him, and that he had spent the 4 weeks since dreading the day a stranger would arrive expecting something he did not know how to give. Her name was Hazel Wren, and she was 29, and she had crossed 1,100 miles because there was nothing left in Ohio worth staying for. The man waiting beside a buckboard with the collar of his coat turned up was named Wade Coyne, and the snow had already begun to come down sideways off the pass. He looked at her thin shawl, and he did not speak, and then he took off his own heavy sheepskin coat and held it out to her without a word, and that was the first thing that ever passed between them. Everyone in that valley expected her to be on the next eastbound train by spring. They were wrong, and the manner of how wrong they were is the whole of this story. Stay with me, because the coldest night of all is still 6 weeks off, and what happened in it changed 2 guarded people for the rest of their lives. Wade Coyne had built his place 11 years back, a low log house and a pole barn on 160 acres of bench land above Coyne's Crossing, which had taken his family name not because the Coynes were grand, but because they had been the first to dig a well there that did not go dry in August. His father had died of a chest cold in a winter much like the one coming, and his mother had followed 2 years after, and Wade had been alone on the bench since he was 26. He ran 400 head of cattle in a good year and fewer in a bad one, and he kept a saddle horse named Pilot, a deep-chested bay gelding with one white sock, who had carried him through 3 winters and knew the trail down to the crossing in the dark. Wade was a man who had learned to talk to the horse because the horse did not expect him to be clever. He was not a hard man. He was a quiet one, which the valley sometimes mistook for the same thing. When his sister Ruth, married now and living down in Stevensville, had pressed him for 2 years to find a wife, he had finally agreed only because the loneliness had begun to feel like a weight he carried into the barn every morning. And she had written the notice and posted it, and a woman from Ohio had answered. And now that woman was sitting beside him on the buckboard seat wearing his coat while the snow filled the wheel ruts ahead of Pilot's careful hooves. They did not speak much on the ride up. The trail climbed in long switchbacks through timber that closed in dark and wet on either side, and the snow came thicker as the buckboard rose, and Pilot leaned into the collar without being asked, knowing the grade. Hazel watched the man's hands on the lines, cracked across the knuckles and steady and never once jerking the horse, and she watched how he eased the brake on the downgrades with his boot rather than hauling the lines, and she thought that he had given her his coat at the depot without being asked and without seeming to think it was worth remarking on, and she filed that away the way she filed everything, quietly, for later. She had learned long ago to read men by their hands and by the small things they did when they thought no one was tallying. Her father had been a kind man with idle hands and a weakness for other people's schemes, a man whose warmth everyone praised and no one could lean on. And in the spring of 1879 he had signed his name to a note for a friend's flour mill on the strength of a handshake and a glass of good whiskey, and when the friend defaulted in the autumn, the note came due on her father and the house in Zanesville went with it. The shame of it had taken the heart out of him within the year. He stopped going to the lodge, he stopped reading the paper. He took to his bed with a cough that the town doctor called a chest weakness and gave him 3 months, and Hazel had nursed him for 11, reading every pamphlet the county lending library held on the diseases of the lungs and the easing of them, learning what to do because no one else would, and there was no money for a man to come and do it. She had buried him beside her mother in the frozen ground that January, and totaled what was left, which came to $11, and a trunk of books, and a name in Zanesville that meant ruin. A neighbor lent her a St. Paul paper to wrap her good plates in, and folded into the back of it, among the advertisements for stoves and seed, was the matrimonial notice. And she had read it standing in the empty kitchen and thought, with the dry clarity that had become her only inheritance, that a sensible woman who did not mind quiet was a thing she could be, having been quiet a long time already. She had not told Wade Coyne in her 3 careful letters that she could set a bone or read the signs of a failing lung or stitch a wound closed with a sailmaker's needle and a steady hand. She had not told him she had kept a dying man alive 8 months past the doctor's guess by sheer stubborn attention. She had not thought any of it would matter to a man who wanted a cook and a quiet house on a cattle bench in Montana. She would learn otherwise, and so would he. And so would the whole of the valley below. The house, when they reached it in the blue dark, was clean and bare and cold, and Wade lit the stove with hands that knew the work in the dark and stood awkwardly by the door while she took in the single room. There was a rope bed in the corner with a tick mattress and 2 gray blankets squared off at the foot the way a soldier might leave them. There was a table he had plainly built himself, the joints honest and a little heavy, with 2 stools. There was a shelf with 3 tin plates, a coffee pot, a skillet hung on a nail. There was nothing on the walls. There were no curtains, no rug, no second chair drawn close to the first. None of the small accumulations a person makes when they expect to be looked at by someone who cares for them. He had not known what a wife would want, so he had bought nothing and changed nothing, and the bareness of the place told her more about the 11 years he had spent alone in it than a long letter ever could have. She set her carpet-bag down on the swept floor. He cleared his throat and said that he would sleep in the barn until such time as she felt otherwise, and that she should take the bed, and that there was a circuit preacher who came through the crossing the 2nd Sunday of each month, and if she still wanted the arrangement to be what the notice had promised, then it could be done, and if she did not, he would pay her passage back to Ohio, and there would be no hard feelings and no word of it spread in the valley. It was the most words he had said since the platform. She looked at him a long moment, at the way he held his hat in both hands like a man at a graveside, and she understood that he was as frightened as she was and had simply had longer to practice not showing it. Then she said that she would cook supper from whatever was in the larder, and that they could speak of preachers when she had seen whether the man could be lived with. Which was only fair, since he had bought her sight unseen the same as she had come sight unseen. He almost smiled at that. He went out to the barn with a lantern and a bedroll, and Hazel found in the larder a sack of beans, a side of bacon going rancid at the edge she trimmed away, an onion and flour and salt, and she made a supper of it and set 2 plates on the table and went and stood in the barn door to tell him it was ready, and they ate across the table he had built in a silence that was not yet easy but was no longer hostile. That was the first night. He took the lantern back to the barn. She lay in the rope bed listening to the wind find every chink in the logs and counting them the way she had counted her father's breaths. And she did not sleep. Across the yard in the cold barn, bedded down in the straw beside Pilot with his coat for a blanket, neither did he. The first weeks were a slow accounting of 2 people learning the shape of each other across a single room and a hard country. Hazel found the place wanting in the particular ways a careful person finds any place wanting, and she set about it without asking permission, because asking permission had never gotten her anything. She scrubbed the floor and chinked the worst gaps in the logs with rag and mud, and she went through Wade's meager larder and made a list and gave it to him for the next trip to the crossing, and he read it twice and bought every item on it without comment, including the dried apples and the good coffee that were not strictly necessary, which she also filed away. She found his books, which were 2, a Bible and a worn volume on the diseases of cattle, and she set her own beside them the medical pamphlets and a Dickens and a thick book on the setting of fractures, and she saw him look at the spines one evening and then look away, and she understood that he could not read them, or read them only slowly, and she said nothing, because shaming a man for what he had never been taught was the kind of cruelty her father had suffered, and she would not deal it. Instead, she began on the long evenings to read aloud, starting with the Dickens because it was the least like a lesson and had a villain in it a man could enjoy hating. She read at the table with the lamp between them, and Wade sat across with a bridle or a broken hame-strap he was mending, his hands working leather while he listened, and at first he pretended the listening was incidental to the mending. By the third evening, he had stopped pretending. He let the leather lie in his lap. When she closed the book, he would sit a moment as if the room had been somewhere else and was only now coming back, and then he would say good night and take the lantern to the barn. On the fourth evening, he asked her, very low, with his eyes on the leather and not on her, whether she would read him the cattle book sometime, the part about the lungs, because he had lost 9 calves to the lungs 2 winters back, and had stood in the barn watching them go, and never once known what he was looking at or whether anything could have been done. She found the part about the lungs and read it to him slow, and where the words ran to Latin she put them into plain English, and Wade listened the way a man listens to water in a dry month, leaning in, asking her to go back over the part about the wet cough and the part about keeping the sick ones warm and apart. When she finished he was quiet, and then he said that if he had known that 2 winters back, he might have saved 4 of them, maybe 5, and there was no self-pity in it, only the plain arithmetic of a man who measured himself by what he could keep alive. Something between them shifted that night, not toward love yet, but toward use, and on the frontier use was very often the road that love took, because a hard country gave 2 people no leisure to fall into one another, and only the long, slow proof of being needed and not failing the need. The valley took its measure of her at the crossing, where she went with Wade on the supply days and stood in the store, while the women looked at her thin Ohio coat and her cracked town shoes and made their judgments. The storekeeper's wife, a broad, capable woman named Effie Tarr, told her plainly over the flour barrel that the last woman Wade Coyne had courted, years back, had left him standing at a dance and married a man with a sawmill, and that nobody up the bench held a hard winter against a body, and that she should not feel ashamed to go home before the deep cold if the place did not suit. It was kindly meant, and it was a verdict all the same. The men were worse and quieter about it. A rancher named Del Surratt, who ran a bigger spread down the valley and had wanted Wade's bench land and his well for years, leaned on the counter and said, loud enough to carry, that a man who had to send away to St. Paul for a woman would have the same luck keeping her that he had keeping fence, and a few men laughed and Wade's jaw set, and he paid for the goods and walked out, and Hazel walked out behind him with her chin level. On the ride up, she said only that she had been laughed at by better men than that, and Wade made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh himself, the first she had heard from him. Have you ever been measured by a room full of strangers and found wanting before you spoke a word? She had. It did not move her the way they meant it to. It only made her quieter and more exact, and exactness, in the weeks to come, was the thing that saved them. By the middle of January, the bench was locked in white. The cattle had been brought down to the home pastures, and the haystacks Wade had cut and stacked through the long, bright September days stood dwindling against the barn. And every morning he broke the ice on the trough with an axe and forked hay against the wind while his breath froze in his beard. Hazel had taken over the inside of the place entirely and a good deal of the outside, and they had fallen into a rhythm that neither of them named. 2 people working a hard place from opposite ends and meeting in the middle at a table where the food was good now and the silences had gone from awkward to easy. She had set a bone in his hand the second week, a finger he had jammed throwing a calf, and she had splinted it with 2 flat sticks and strips of an old shirt and told him not to use it for 10 days, and he had used it on the 8th day, and she had splinted it again without scolding, and he had looked at her with something he did not have a word for. He had begun leaving things by the door before dawn. Firewood, split fine the way she liked it for the cook stove. A bucket of water carried up so she would not have to break the trough ice herself in the dark. He never spoke of these things, and she never thanked him for them aloud, because she had understood by then that the leaving of them was itself the speech, that this was a man who said what he meant with his hands because his mouth had never learned the words. One morning she found, set on the bench by the door, a small shelf he had made in the barn at night by lantern light. The wood planed smooth and rubbed with tallow until it shone faint, and fitted along the front edge with a carved lip, a low raised rail no thicker than a finger, so that her books would not slide off when the wagon was loaded rough or the door slammed in a wind. A plain shelf would have held the books just as well. The lip served no purpose a flat board would not have served except the purpose of a man who had thought about her books sliding, and minded the idea of it, and had stood in a cold barn after a full day's work shaping a length of cedar so that a thing she loved would be safe. She held it a long time in the cold morning light, turning it in her raw hands, running her thumb along the carved rail. Then she drove a nail and hung it on the wall above the table, the first thing that had ever hung on those bare walls, and she set her medical pamphlets and the Dickens and the fracture book along it, and that evening she read to him with the shelf at her shoulder and a warmth in the room that had nothing to do with the stove. The circuit preacher had come through the crossing twice now and gone again, and neither of them had spoken of him either time, and both of them lay awake on their separate sides of the yard knowing it, and neither yet had the courage or the right words to cross the cold ground between the house and the barn, and say what the firewood and the water bucket and the carved lip had already been saying for weeks. The private wound surfaced in February, on a still night when the cold came down so hard the nails in the walls cracked like pistol shots, and the two of them sat close to the stove for the only warmth in the world. Hazel had asked him, plainly, why he had never married, and Wade had been quiet so long she thought he would not answer. And then he told her about the woman at the dance, not bitterly, only as a fact, and how after that he had decided he was a man better suited to cattle than to people, and how the deciding had been a kind of relief and a kind of grave both. Then he asked her, because it was owed, why a woman would cross 1,100 miles to a stranger, and Hazel told him about her father and the note and the mill and the house lost, and how she had learned that kindness without sense was just another way of being cruel to the people who loved you, and how she had come west not for love, which she had stopped expecting, but for a place where her sense might be worth something. She told him she had a confession. The notice had asked for a woman who did not mind quiet, and she had answered as that woman. But the truth was, she did not love quiet. She had only grown used to it, and what she had wanted her whole life was a house where the quiet was a choice and not a sentence. Wade listened. Then he said, low, that his sister had written the notice, that he had not had the words for it himself, and that if they were trading confessions, then his was that he had lied first, because the notice made him sound like a man who knew his own mind, and he had not known it until she sat down at his table. They did not touch. They did not need to. The stove ticked and the cold cracked the nails, and something that had been frozen a long time in each of them began, very slowly, to give. What neither of them yet knew was that the winter had not shown its worst, and that the worst would come fast and from the north, the way the worst always came in that country. The last week of February the air went strange and warm for a day, a false thaw that brought the cattle nosing at the bare patches and brought Del Surratt up the bench on a fine horse to make Wade an offer for the well land one more time. Lower than ever, framed as a kindness to a man who surely could not winter a wife and a herd both. Wade declined. Surratt looked at Hazel on the porch and said that there was no shame in a body knowing when it was beaten, and rode off, and that night the temperature fell 40 degrees between dusk and midnight, and the snow began, and it did not stop. By the second day the world was a white roar, and the trail to the crossing was gone, and the haystacks were buried to the eaves, and the cattle had drifted with the wind against the south fence where they would pile and smother if they were not turned. Wade went out into it because there was nothing else a man could do, and Hazel watched him saddle Pilot in the swirling barn, and she did not tell him to stay, because she had buried a man who let other people decide his courage for him, and she would not unman this one. But she packed his coat pockets with hardtack and a flask of coffee gone cold, and she told him the thing that mattered, which was to keep the wind always on his right cheek going out, so he would know to keep it on his left coming home. He looked at her. Then he was gone into the white, and she stood in the doorway until she could no longer see horse or man, only snow. He was out the rest of that day and into the dark. Hazel kept the stove fed and a lamp burning in the window, though the window showed nothing but driven white. And she did the chores she could reach, and she watched the trail that was not there. The cattle, she would learn after, had drifted nearly 2 miles before Wade reached them, and he had spent the long afternoon riding the edge of the bunched herd, turning them off the fence and back toward the hay, working in air so cold the spit froze on his lips. And somewhere in the worst of it, Pilot had gone through a drifted creek, crossing to the chest, and lunged out, streaming, and Wade's left leg had soaked through and frozen stiff in the stirrup. By the time the herd was turned and moving the right way, the light was gone and the cold was a living thing, and Wade could no longer feel his hands or his soaked leg, and he gave Pilot his head because the horse knew the bench better than he did, and he kept the wind on his left cheek the way she had told him. And that one instruction, given at the door by a woman everyone in the valley expected to quit by spring, was the thing that brought him within sight of the lamp. He fell off the horse in the yard. He could not stand. He called out once, and the wind ate it. But Hazel had been watching the window for 9 hours, and she saw, in a slackening of the snow, the dark shape of Pilot standing patient by the rail, and no rider on him, and she went out into it bareheaded. She found Wade face down in the snow 10 feet from the porch, and she could not lift him, so she did the thing the fracture book and the long nursing of her father had taught her, which was to stop wanting what she could not do and do what she could. She rolled him onto the horse blanket she had grabbed, and she dragged him by the collar of his own sheepskin coat, the coat he had given her at the depot, and she had given back when she had a coat of her own. 8 feet to the porch and over the sill and onto the floor by the stove, and her hands were past pain by then, and so were his. She got his frozen boot off by cutting the leather with his own knife because the swelling would not let it pull, and the leg beneath was white and hard to the touch, and she knew enough to know that warming it too fast at the stove would do more harm than the freezing had, so she did not put it near the fire. She filled the wash basin with water just off the chill, not hot, and she worked the leg into it and changed the water as the cold leached out of the flesh, degree by patient degree, the way the pamphlet said, and she rubbed his hands between her own, and breathed on his fingers and put them inside her own clothes against the warm skin of her belly to bring them back slow. She did not weep, because weeping used heat she needed. She worked. She lost track of the hours. Wade drifted and surfaced, and at the worst of the rewarming, when the feeling came back into the dead flesh and brought its long agony with it, he gripped the leg of the table and made no sound, and she put her face down close to his and told him to hold on, that the pain was the blood coming home, that pain was the good news. Toward dawn the white went out of his leg and the gray came into it, and then in patches, the angry red of living tissue, and she knew she had saved the foot, and she sat back on her heels on the cold floor and shook. He slept the day through and woke in the afternoon with the storm blown out, and a hard blue sky in the window and his leg propped and wrapped and aching in a way that meant it was his again. Hazel was asleep in the chair beside him with her chin on her chest, gray with exhaustion, her hands raw and cracked, worse than his had ever been from the long night of water. He looked at her a while, then he said her name, the first time he had said it soft, and she came awake all at once the way a nurse does, reaching for him before her eyes were open. He told her the leg felt like his own. She told him he was a fool who had nearly died for cattle, and there was no heat in it. He said the cattle were turned, that he had counted them off the fence before the dark, that the herd would winter. Then he was quiet, working at something, and she let him work at it because she had learned that this was a man who could not be hurried into words. At last he said that he had ridden home by the wind on his left cheek, that he would not have known to do it, that her telling him at the door was the whole reason he was lying on his own floor and not stiff in a drift 2 miles south. He said it plainly, looking at the ceiling, and then he said the other thing, the thing he had no skill at, which was that he did not want her on any eastbound train, not in spring, not ever, and that the preacher came through the second Sunday, and that if she was willing he would like to make the arrangement what the notice had promised, only that the notice had it wrong, because he had not wanted a sensible wife who did not mind quiet. He had wanted her, and he had not known it was her he wanted until she walked out of the white dragging him home. It was the longest speech of his life and the plainest, and it did not sound like a speech at all. She did not gloat. She did not say that the valley had given her until spring. She put her cracked hand over his cracked hand on the blanket and said yes, and that was all, and it was enough. The circuit preacher married them the second Sunday of March in the cold log house with the snow still deep on the bench, and Effie Tarr and her husband Lon standing as witnesses and Pilate stamping at the rail in the yard. Effie wept into her good handkerchief and said afterward, over the cake she had hauled up the thawing trail herself, that she had told this girl to her face by the flour barrel to go home before the deep cold, and that she had never in her life been so glad to be wrong about a thing, and she made Hazel promise to forget she had ever said it, which Hazel did, because Hazel did not keep that kind of account. Word of the marriage went down the valley the way all word went, and even Del Surratt, who had wanted the well land for years and had said in the store that Wade Coyne would keep a wife the way he kept fence, was reported to have said when he heard of it that the Coyne luck had finally turned, which from a man like Surratt was as near to an apology as the valley would ever get, and Hazel, when it was carried up to her, only said that she hoped his fence was holding and let it lie. She did not gloat. The work would do her talking, and the work began at once. She hung her medical pamphlets and her fracture book on the carved-lipped shelf where any neighbor with a hurt child or a feverish wife would know to find her, and the valley that had measured her by her town shoes and her thin Ohio coat began slowly and then all at once to send for her by name. Before the next winter was out, she had set a dozen bones, brought down 2 fevers that the families had given up on, lanced a blood poisoning that would have taken a man's arm, and delivered the Tar girl's first baby in a sod house in a sleet storm with Effie holding the lamp and praying out loud. The men who had laughed in the store learned to take their hats off when Hazel Coyne came through the door, because sooner or later every one of them had a child she had sat up the night with. They were not a demonstrative pair. Wade rebuilt the south fence that first spring with new cedar posts set deeper than his father had ever set them, and he ran his 400 head and then 500, and he never again rode out into weather without stopping at the door to tell her which cheek he would keep the wind on going out, a small ritual that began as plain caution and became, across the years, a kind of vow spoken in the cold doorway, the nearest thing to a tender word that a man like him could shape with his mouth. The valley remarked on it sometimes, how little the Coynes said to one another, how they could sit a whole supper at Effie's table and trade barely a dozen words between them. And the valley was wrong about that the same as it had been wrong about everything else concerning the 2 of them, because it did not see the firewood split fine and left by the cook stove before dawn for 41 years, or the way he carved a fresh lip on a fresh shelf every time the old one filled past holding with her books and the children's after them, or the way she warmed his big, cracked hands between her own every cold morning of their lives, long after his hands had stopped needing the warming, only because the morning he had come home half frozen she had warmed them so, and neither of them ever said why she still did it. They ranched the bench for 41 years. They had 3 children who lived, 2 boys and a girl, and Hazel taught all 3 to read at the table with the carved shelf at their shoulders. And the girl, Cora, grew up watching her mother set bones and went east to a women's medical college in 1909 and came home a doctor and practiced in Coynes Crossing until she was old, the first the valley ever had. The older boy took the ranch and the younger took up surveying and laid out half the county roads, and the well that gave the crossing its name never once went dry. Wade's leg ached in the deep cold every winter of his life, and he never once complained of it, only flexed the foot by the stove of an evening while Hazel read aloud, because the ache was his own, and he had been given it bringing the herd home, and a man does not complain of the price of a thing he would pay again. He died in the spring of 1925, 87 years old, with his hand in hers, and she followed him in the autumn, and the family buried them together on the low hill above the house where the bench fell away to the valley, and the Bitterroot stood blue and enormous to the west. The marker gave their names and the years and nothing else, because nothing else needed saying. When Cora was an old woman herself, a county historian came to ask her about the early days, and asked what had made her parents' marriage last when it had begun as a stranger answering a paper. And Cora thought a while and said that her father had told her once when she was small and asking the same kind of question that the coldest night of his life had also been the warmest, because that was the night he understood that the woman he had sent away for had never been sent for at all, that she had come on her own and stayed on her own, and dragged him home through the snow by the collar of his own coat. Up on the hill the wind still keeps to one cheek and then the other, the way it always did, and the firewood by that long cold stove was split fine to the very end. Some things refuse to be what you ordered and turn out to be the only thing you ever truly wanted. If a story like this warmed you tonight, tell me in a few words about the person who once gave you their coat when you were cold. And if you want another of these, stay close, and I will tell you of the schoolteacher who came to a valley that did not want her and the rancher who could not say her name.